In this JavaScript tutorial, we're going to take a comprehensive look into the ternary operator. We're going to discuss what a ternary operator is, why they're important to use, and then we're going to walk through a number of examples. So the very first question is, what is a ternary operator? Kind of has a weird name, and you're going to find out later it has an even more weird syntax. So a ternary operator is simply a conditional in JavaScript that can be placed on a single line. Ternary operators are important to learn because, as you're going to see in the screencast, they're required when building out conditionals directly into applications such as React apps or Vue applications. We're going to take a very different approach to walking through the ternary operator than I've seen from other videos. We're first going to look and analyze at what a ternary operator would look like in a React application, and then we're going to go through two examples. We're going to start off with a basic, just very similar to an if-else conditional, and then we're going to see how you can implement compound conditionals directly into the ternary operator. As always, I'll be following along in the comment section, so if you have any questions, comments, recommendations, anything like that, feel free to add those and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. And if this video was helpful along your own coding journey, please give it a like and subscribe so I can keep on making more of them. So with all that being said, let's dive into the code. Let's walk through the code for the ternary operator, and we're first going to start off by looking at why the ternary operator in JavaScript is necessary. And the reason why I'm going with this approach is because I have seen through the years that the ternary operator can be very confusing, as a very different syntax than the regular JavaScript conditional or even the switch statement. And so I want to first show why ternary operators are important to understand, because the very first question that I usually get from a student after I have shown them how to use a ternary operator is, why in the world would I want to use this really weird looking syntax when I could use a regular if-else conditional or a case statement? And it's a fair question until you see the rationale for why. So I'm going to open up the HTML tab right here, and I'm going to write what looks like HTML, but it's actually a templating engine called JSX. And so if you write any programs, or you ever want to write any programs in React or Vue, then you might use JSX in order to write out your templates. And so it looks a lot like HTML. And for the sake of example, you can just imagine that it's HTML if you've never used it before, because it looks like it. So I'm going to create a div here. And let's imagine that I'm building out a React project, and I want to show or I want to hide a div, and let's say it's a tab. And the way that I can do that is by saying class name equals, and then in curly brackets here, I can write some JavaScript code. Now, if I want to show or hide this specific div or this tab or whatever it is, then I need to have some conditional logic. So say we want to check to see if someone has the right permissions, then I can't do something like this. I can't write a regular conditional and say if has permission triple equals true, and then on another line like this have all of my logic. That is not something that is allowed. So I'm going to get rid of all of that. And let's see what we can do. So this is where the ternary operator comes in. So I have to write this all on one line, and what a ternary operator allows you to do is to write an entire conditional on a single line. So here what I could say is has permission, and then I'm going to do a question mark, and then we'll say active. And I'm making all of this up right here. This is just an example to show what you may build, and then we're going to get into real examples later on. So I could say active, colon, and then disabled. So what I've done here is I've provided a conditional. So this is the same thing as saying if has permission, then I want you to return active, and if not, I want you to return disabled. And so this is the only way, or the proper way I should say, for building a conditional in tools like React or Vue, so that you can have some dynamic behavior built directly into your HTML and your JSX. So this is the main reason why ternary operators are so important to learn, because if you are building out any kind of real world front-end application, you're most likely going to have to build in something like this at some point or another. So now that you've seen the example, I'm going to comment this out, and now let's go into the JavaScript code and let's actually go through real working examples. I'm going to start with a basic one, and then we're going to go into a more advanced one. So I'm going to start off by creating a function here, and I'm going to call it age verification. It's going to take in an age, and then inside of here, I'm going to place the conditional. And if you're brand new to JavaScript and you've never heard of functions at all, do not worry. This is going to be very basic. I'm simply wrapping all the behavior up in a function, so it's easier to call it and print it out down here. So this isn't going to dive into functions in detail. It's just a wrapper for what we're going to be doing. So here I could say if the age is greater than 25, then I want to console log can rent a car. And then right here, I want to provide an else statement, and then say I want it to be console log is not old enough yet. And that's all that we want this function to do. So it's pretty basic. And then I'm going to call this function by saying age verification. If I say 15 here, if I save and then run it, it's going to print out that the user is not old enough. If I change this to 55 and then run it again, now it's going to say they can rent the car. So this is all working properly. It's an incredibly basic function, and this conditional is pretty much as basic as you can get. And I did that on purpose. Anytime that I'm wanting to learn something new, especially something that might be a little bit more on the confusing side, I like to start off with a base case. So we're going to simply comment this out. And then below here, I'm going to show you the syntax that will allow you to have a ternary operator. So we're going to use the exact same logic. We're just going to switch it up and use it with the ternary syntax. So now the way that you can do this is I'm going to store it in a variable. So I'm going to say let answer equals, and then here I'm going to say age greater than 25, and then a question mark, and then I'm going to have it say the same thing. So I'll say can rent a car, and then colon can't rent a car. You could put is not old enough, whatever you want on that side. So that's going to store it in a variable, and then let's simply print out the value of whatever that variable is. So we'll say console log answer. And don't worry, I know I typed all of that out pretty quickly. We're going to walk through exactly what the mapping's doing and everything. So let me hit clear, save, and then run it. And now you're going to see it says they can rent the car. So we're getting the exact same answer as before. If I change this to 5 years old, and hit run, it's going to say they can't rent the car. So this is working perfectly. This is the exact same behavior we were getting when we had that conditional on the 5 lines of code. So let's walk through what's going on. Right here, you can see the very first part of a ternary operator is going to be the conditional. This is exactly the same as saying if age is greater than 25. And so this is the first part. You're going to want to break your ternary operators. The easiest way to think of them is that they're broken into 3 parts. The first part is the conditional. The second part, so after the question mark, the second part is going to be, if that conditional is true, I want you to run this code. Now, if it's not, you have the colon, and now this is going to be what happens if the condition was not met. So if this is false, if the age is not greater than 25, then it's going to skip everything here, and then it's going to pass the colon, say, okay, we want to return whatever is in this value here. Now, I also could have written out the console log statement here. If you're curious on why I stored this in a variable, it's really just for the sake of space, because the ternary operators can get a little bit long. So I could have done something like this. So I could have just said age is greater than 25, and then I could have said console log can't rent a car, and then here console log again, and then can't rent a car, just like this. And now if I save this, I'll clear it and run it, then you'll see that we get the exact same behavior where it says can't rent a car. But typically, because of the way that this works, whenever you have, and let me get rid of all of that just so it's out of the way. So whenever you have a situation where you're using a ternary operator, typically you do not want to put your console log statements actually in the true or the false values here. So let's walk through the mapping just to make this clear, because I cannot tell you how, don't worry, if this looks weird, I can't tell you how many times a student has come up to me and says, I do not like using ternary operators. They don't make any sense. They look weird. I can tell you it just takes practice. And what helped me the most when I was learning them is understanding what the mapping was. So remember, the very first part of it is the first part of the conditional. And so we have if age is greater than 25, we have age is greater than 25. They don't have the if here, but you can just imagine that the if is right in front of it. Then the question mark means that we're now going to break into whatever happens when this is true and when it's false. This right here is the true part. This is like dropping here into line 3 where it says can't or can rent a car. Then after this little colon here, you can imagine that this is the else. So this is exactly what we have here on line 4 where it says else, and then it says can't rent a car. It's exactly what we have here where it says is not old enough. So this is the basic way of implementing a ternary operator. And like you can see, if you ever wanted to implement this in a React application or a Vue app, you couldn't write the code like this. If you wanted to put it on one line directly into the HTML, then you're going to have to write it like we have right here. So that's why it's important to know. I'm going to get rid of all of this, and now let's get into a little bit more of an advanced example. And before we get into this, I want to add the caveat that what I'm about to show you is important to understand, but I would not recommend using it on a regular basis, because the single ternary, after you practiced it enough, it will actually start to become very familiar to you, and it's not going to look as weird as it may look the very first time or second time that you've seen it. What I'm going to show you now is how you can implement compound logic, so multiple conditionals all into the same ternary operator. And I can tell you this is going to look very weird. I've been doing this for a number of years, and when I see a compound conditional built into a ternary, it still takes me a while to kind of dissect the code to see exactly what's happening. So I wouldn't recommend doing this, but it is important to understand, because I have run into a number of projects that I took over and I worked on where the developer did do this, and it was important for me to understand what their logic and what their process was, because if I didn't, then I'd be lost in the code base. So let's walk through a more advanced example. I'm going to create another function here. I'm going to call it admin controls. So we're going to say that the purpose of this function is to either show or hide admin controls. Once again, this is something that is similar to a feature you may build into a React or a Vue or Angular application. So I'll say admin controls. It's going to expect to get a user. And then inside of here, let's follow the same exact process we had before. Let's get it working with a regular if-else conditional, and then we're going to turn that into a full ternary operator. So here, I first want to check to see if the user is logged in. So I'm going to say if user. And now in JavaScript with a conditional, if you're looking for a true or false value, then you don't have to say if user is true. You can just say if user, and it will assume you mean if the user is true, if it exists. So I'm going to say if user, and then I'm going to drop down inside, and I'm going to put another conditional. I'm going to say if. So we know that we have a user, so we can be confident that we can ask the user if they're an admin. So here I'll say if user.admin, and same thing, we're expecting a true or false value on if the user is an admin or not. And then inside of here, I'm just going to console log and say showing admin controls. Just like that. And then if they're not an admin, we need to have some logic for that. So I'm going to say if not, then I want to console log and say you need to be an admin. And then we also need to verify, we need to have a backup for if the user is just a guest user. So maybe the user hasn't signed in. So here I'm going to put another conditional and say else, and then we'll put console log, and then you need to be logged in, just like that. So now let's create some some kind of case studies here. I'm going to say let, and we're going to create 3 user types. So let user 1, this is the full admin. So we'll say they have a name, and this one will be Christine, and it's admin with a value of true. So this is just a basic JavaScript object. And here I will call admin controls, and I'm going to pass in user 1. Now let's save this and let's just verify that this one's working. So if we run this, we should get the showing user controls. And yes, so everything here, it's showing admin controls. That's all working properly. Let's just give ourselves a little bit of space, and we're going to create a few more users. So this one's going to be user 2. And then for this one, we'll give it a different name. And then admin here is going to be false. And then we're going to call it slightly differently, just like this. And now if I save and I run this, we should have the you need to be an admin. So we still have our showing admin controls, and now it says you need to be an admin. So everything there is working perfectly. They dropped into this because it was true, but then they were not an admin, so it fell into the else statement. So everything there is working. And last one, let's say user 3. And this is our guest user. So this is going to be a user who doesn't have any values whatsoever. So we're just going to say user 3, and we're just going to say that they're null. And now this user 3, they should return that you need to be logged in. So let me clear this, hit run, and it should say you need to be logged in, which is perfect. So everything here is working and our conditional is working. But let's imagine that you need to put this in a ternary operator. Now this is going to look very weird. Once again, I would not recommend doing this at all, just because I think it leads to unreadable code. But if you ever come across a ternary operator that looks like this, you're going to know exactly what it's doing. So I'm going to create a variable that we're going to store this in. So I'm going to say let response equals And then here we are looking, and let me comment all this out just so we don't get any false reads on it. So we have this user argument. So I'm going to say user. And then from there, we're going to start off the same way we did with our basic example. So it's going to say user question mark. So we're going to first check, is the user true? Then this is where it gets weird. This is where we're going to place another ternary operator inside of the very first statement, because the way that this logic works is it's going to check to see, is this the case? Is this user, do they exist? So same thing as saying user true, and then we're going to drop in to what happens if it's true. Well, what happens when it's true in this example? Well, we drop in to this second conditional. So that's exactly what we do here with the ternary operator. So we're going to say user dot admin, and then we're going to give another question mark, because this is like asking that second question. So we're going to say user admin, and then here showing admin controls dot dot dot, and then we're going to give what happens if they're not an admin. You need to be an admin. And so now that we have that, now we need to go into that final else. So this is what happens if the user didn't exist. So now we'll say you need to be logged in. Okay, so we stored all of that in the response. Let's just console log that. So we'll say console log response, hit save, clear this, and we should get all of the exact same answers. So if I hit run, there you go. You need to be logged in. Right above it was you need to be an admin, and then showing admin controls. So as you can see, this looks really weird. One thing I will say is, unlike the if-else conditional, the spaces and having these carriage returns where you have all of the code on different lines, that may not be allowed in the JSX, so in your React or Vue application, but you actually can have carriage returns, and it is valid code. So you could make this look something like this. And this is going to look possibly even more weird, but the last time I ran into one of these in the wild in a project, they actually had it all on multiple lines. So I wanted to show that to you. So I could say something like user and then question mark user admin, have the entire conditional right here, and then put this on another line just like that. And for some reason, with the way that JavaScript is compiled, this still will work. So if I hit clear, hit save, and then run this again, everything here still works. So you may see some examples that look something like this. And so just if you ever see this syntax, know that the developer created a ternary operator, in this case, a compounded one. So let's walk through what's going on here, kind of line by line. And so let's start at the top. So we're checking to see if the user exists. That's the same thing as just placing the user right there. Same thing as saying, user triple equals true. And if that is true, they will drop down into this next line here. And if you prefer, if this is just messing you up too much, then let me put this all on a single line again, just so we can read it all just from left to right. So right here, what we're doing is we're saying, is the user, do they exist? Yes. Okay, well, now it's time to drop into another conditional. One thing that does help me whenever I'm working with this kind of code is I like to wrap the separate ones up in parens, just like this. This makes it a little bit easier. And as you'll see, this also works exactly the same way. So now if I hit run, everything still works, but I think, at least in my opinion, this is a little bit easier to read, and it shows that this is a nested conditional. And technically, you could keep on nesting them. You could have another conditional here, or you could have it in the else block, but to me, even having two of them is honestly a little bit too much, but it's it's your world. You get to live in it, so build your conditionals however you want. But I just hope I wouldn't have to take over your code base if that is what you decide on doing. So what we're just getting back to, we have the user, first conditional. They drop in to this conditional. This is the same thing as what we have here on lines 3 through 7, where it says, if this is the case, I want you to show the admin controls. If not, I want you need to be an admin. So same process. And then finally, if the user didn't exist, so if this was false, then it skips everything here until it finds the final colon, and then it says you need to be logged in. So what we wrote here on line 12 is exactly the same as what we wrote on line 2 to 10. As you can see, the behavior is identical, but the difference is if you ever need to write your conditional all on one line, then this is the syntax that will allow you to do that. Now, if this was confusing to you at all, and do not feel bad if it was, ternary operators are one of the more confusing parts of learning JavaScript, especially in the beginning, then what my recommendation would be is to go through the show notes. I'll provide all of this code for you. Put it into your own code pen, use it on your local system, and then play with it. Make some changes. Look and see what happens if you change something in this part of the conditional, or and see how it maps to what you have here in the normal if-else statement. Go through it until it starts to really sink in and make sense. And then once you get into learning about React and these other frameworks, and you see one of these ternary operators, you're going to know exactly what to do.